Okay, let's unpack this. For the longest time, the story we've had about echidnas and platypuses, those totally unique egg-laying mammals. Well, the idea was they came from a land-based ancestor, and the platypus just sort of went its own way into the water later. But what if that's not quite right? Maybe not the whole story at all.
Well, based on the sources you shared, there's some fascinating new fossil analysis out. And it really does suggest their evolution might have taken a much more surprising path.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to really dig into this new evidence. We want to understand what it means for these incredible creatures. And it seems to boil down to one specific clue, right? A single bone.
That's right. A humerus, so the upper arm bone, it belonged to an extinct species, Kryoryctes cadburyi. It was actually found decades ago now down in Dinosaur Cove in Australia.
Okay.
And yeah, the standard view, the one we've had for ages, is that Monotremes, that's the group with echidnas and platypuses, they started out on land. Platypus, with its weird bill and webbed feet, that was seen as the one that later adapted to water.
Right. That's the picture I think most of us have. Land first, and then platypus takes a swim. But this new research flips that. It's suggesting something totally different.
It really does. It hints that maybe their ancestor was already living partly in water.
Whoa.
And what's really interesting, as Professor Suzanne Ham points out in the material, is how unusual that is.
Yeah.
You see land mammals going into the water all the time. Think whales, dolphins, seals, even otters. Loads of examples.
Sure, that makes sense.
But the other way around. An animal lineage coming out of the water back onto land. It's much, much rarer in the evolutionary story. Finding evidence for that is quite something. It kind of makes you rethink how evolution can work, doesn't it? It's not always a one-way street to say land.
Definitely turns the usual idea on its head. So you said this Kryoryctes humerus has been known for a while. Why the new look now?
Good question. Initially, just looking at its shape, its outer form, it did seem somewhat similar to a modern echidna's humerus. So one idea was maybe this is an early echidna ancestor. Or alternatively, maybe it's an ancestor to both echidnas and platypuses, what we call a stem monotreme, kind of an earlier branch before they split.
Right, a common ancestor.
Exactly. But the big question was, did Kryoryctes live on land like echidnas do today? Or was it more like a platypus, semi-aquatic? And the outside shape alone, it just wasn't definitive.
So the outside wasn't telling the full story. What did they do differently this time?
They went deeper, literally. This new research used techniques like CT scanning and other imaging methods to analyze the internal structure of the bone, the microstructure.
Looking inside the bone itself.
Precisely. Because while the external shape can hint at relationships, the internal bone architecture, that often reveals a lot more about how the animal actually lived, its lifestyle, its ecology.
Like reading the blueprints inside the bone to figure out its job.
You got it. Was the bone really dense and heavy? That might suggest it needed ballast for diving. Or was it lighter, more porous, like you'd expect in a land animal?
Okay, so what did they find? What was the big reveal inside this Kryoryctes bone?
Well, this is the kicker. The internal structure, the density and pattern, it looked much more like a platypus bone.
No way.
Yes, platypuses have these characteristically thick, dense bones. They act almost like natural weights, helping them dive and stay submerged while they're looking for food. Echidna bones are much lighter.
Wow, so this fossil, it's like 108 million years old, right?
Roughly, yeah.
And on the outside, it looked a bit echidna-like, but the inside screamed, diver! Yeah, that's a real twist.
It's a very strong pointer. The implication is pretty clear. It suggests that the common ancestor of both echidnas and platypuses was probably semi-aquatic.
That completely changes the starting point for their evolution. And you mentioned the age 108 million years ago. That's deep in the Mesozoic era, dinosaur times.
Absolutely. And what's really key here is that back then, monotremes and their close relatives were actually quite dominant among the mammals in Australia. They were the main mammals around. But finding fossils from that time, especially limb bones like this humerus, it's incredibly rare. Most of what we find are tiny teeth or bits of jaw.
So this bone is like a super rare snapshot into how these early mammals lived.
Exactly. It's an exceptional piece of evidence. It gives us a window into their actual lifestyle, not just who they were related to.
It really paints a different scene for ancient Australia. Okay, so if their ancestors were semi-aquatic, does that mean modern echidnas might still have some leftover clues? Some odd traits that suddenly make more sense?
That's a fantastic question, and Yes, the research touches on this. There are several, well, slightly weird things about echidnas today that could potentially be echoes of a watery past.
Like what?
Well, take the echidna's beak, or snout. It doesn't have the super-sensitive electroreceptors like a platypus bill uses to find food underwater by detecting tiny electrical fields.
Right, the platypus's superpower.
Exactly. But echidnas do have some receptors in their beak, and some scientists think these might be sort of evolutionary leftovers, remnants from a time when their ancestors had a more platypus-like bill. And get this, echidna embryos. They actually show temporary structures that look a bit like a developing platypus bill.
That's amazing. Little developmental hints. What else?
Then there are their back feet. Echidna hind feet turn outwards, kind of backwards.
Yeah, I've seen pictures. They look a bit awkward on land.
They do. But platypuses have similarly oriented feet, and they use them like rudders for steering when they swim. Now, echidnas use those feet mainly for digging, for burrowing, which is actually quite an unusual way to burrow compared to other digging mammals, except for platypuses, which also dig burrows.
So maybe the feet were originally for swimming and then got repurposed for digging when they moved onto land?
It's certainly a possibility. An old tool, new job, like you said, and there's more. Echidnas apparently show a diving reflex.
A diving reflex in an echidna.
Yeah. If they're submerged, their body does things to conserve. Oxygen or heart rate slows down. Blood flow changes. Things you typically see in animals adapted for diving. Why would a land animal have such a pronounced reflex?
Good point. Unless?
Unless their ancestors needed it. And one last thing, myoglobin. It's a protein in muscles that stores oxygen, like little scuba tanks inside the muscle.
Okay.
Platypuses, being divers, have lots of it. But surprisingly, echidnas also have higher levels than you might expect of a specific type of myoglobin 1 linked to better oxygen storage, good for diving. It makes perfect sense for a platypus. But it's a bit of a puzzle in an echidna.
Yeah.
Unless you consider this semi-aquatic ancestor idea.
So all these little quirks, the beak hints, the feet, the reflex, the myoglobin, they start to form a pattern suggesting this watery past. But the sources are careful to say the fossil record isn't perfect, right? There's still gaps.
Oh, absolutely. That's crucial. The fossil record from this period is still pretty sparse. This Kryoryctes bone is huge, but it's one piece. It's still really difficult to say exactly when the echidna line fully committed to land and why their bones got lighter over time. We need more fossils to pin that down.
But people are looking, I think I read about Lightning Ridge, the opal fossils.
Yes, exactly. That's a really exciting area. Researchers are actively investigating opalized fossils from Lightning Ridge in New South Wales. These fossils are roughly the same age as Kryoryctes, and the hope is, maybe they'll turn up more ancestral monotremes, maybe fill in some blanks in the story.
Fingers crossed for that. Okay, so let's try and sum this up. The big picture seems to be shifting. This near evidence, especially from the inside of that Kryoryctes bone, really strengthens the case that monotremes, the ancestors of both echidnas and platypuses, probably started out as semi-aquatic animals.
That's the main thrust, yes. And then, later on, the echidna branch adapted back to living entirely on land.
Which, as you said, is the really surprising part, that water-to-land transition within mammals. It's not the usual direction we think of.
It's definitely the less common path. It highlights how flexible and sometimes unpredictable evolution can be.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? When you consider these findings, what other weird or unique features we see in animals today might actually have totally unexpected origins? Maybe things tied to environments their ancestors lived in, places completely different from where they are now. Features we assume are brand new might just be old adaptations given a new lease on life. Gives you a whole new way to look at the strangeness out there.